So hello and welcome back to the channel. Welcome to another Assetto Corsa Competizione video. In today's video I wanted to take a little look at the setups menu. I've just paused that there. But yeah, I just wanted to have a look at the little setups menu. A lovely beautiful day outside as well. I'm almost squinting with the window behind me there. But yeah, let's just get straight into this video because I can see it being quite a long video. So let's just return to this garage, and I'm just going to install the aggressive setup just so that we're not looking at a setup that I'm working on. And I just wanted to run through. You can see on the right hand side it shows you tyres, and then as you select each one of these, nothing really changes. And I think in this little menu on the right hand side here, things should start to change. You see it says on the tyres page you can set your tyre pressures and alignment values, which is a toe in and a camber, and for each of the four wheels the values you set are updated in real time no matter what other changes you do in the rest of the setup. The system will keep updating the car setup in the background to keep the values consistent or constant. The last readings boxes on the side show OMI temperatures outside, middle and inside of the tyre. At the moment you paused or press paused and return to the setup screen. They are the current hot core temperature readings, and so on, blah de blah de blah de blah. Doesn't really tell us a great deal what we're actually trying to achieve. And for each of these, I think as you click down them, it should tell you something different as you go through all these things. It just tells you dampers are completely configurable in bump and rebound, both slow and fast piston speeds. Well, that's great. It doesn't really tell you what you want to do with them. So in this video I want to go through each one of these, and I'm going to adjust what you see on the right hand side of the screen, and I'm going to put what should be in that section, what I believe should be in that section. So I'm going to read these off and I'll change them on the screen so you can see them, but it's quite a lot of stuff to remember. So I thought I would print out a load of details, and let's just have a look at this in detail. So first of all, let's have a look at the PSI settings. So when setting your PSI, pay close attention to values once you've ran about 3 to 5 laps. Once you can see the hot pressures during the lap, you can then set the cold pressures in the garage or the setup menu, whichever one you come to first. And you're looking to get 27.3 to 27.8 in dry conditions and 29.8 to 30.3 psi in the wet conditions. Let's move down to the toe angles. Generally on the front you will see a negative value, and on the rear you'll see positive. Usually it will never differ from this unless you're going completely flat on the front and flat at the rear. So in the toe out section, which is a -0.4 for example, is a negative value which is recommended at the front of the car, as this reduces understeer and creates a more responsive car during the turning phase of the corner. That's toe out, which is a negative value. Toe in is a positive value, which I recommend for the rear of the car to reduce oversteer. Both values will increase tyre wear and tyre temperatures, and should be used with low values such as 1 to 3 degrees maximum on both front and rear. So generally you're not going to see anything more than something like that at the front, or a negative value, or always a negative value. You're generally not going to see positive values at the front of the car. At the rear of the car it would be always the opposite way around, so you're always going to see positive values to about 0.3, and you're never going to really see a negative value at the rear of the car. But sometimes I'll run it with no toe at all. Moving back to the camber. Now, only negative values are used in Assetto Corsa Competizione, which can range from around -5 to around minus 0.5. For example, as negative camber values increase from say 0.5 to -2, cornering grip will increase as the tyre contact patch increases as the car leans over during cornering. So if you imagine the tyre sat on the road like this being the road surface, and as we decrease tyre camber, or the negative value, this angle starts to go like this. So you're getting more and more contact patch when the car's sat straight, but when you start cornering, the tyre will start leaning over on the outside of the tyre tread, which isn't really what you want. You're wanting the tyre to sit like this during most driving straight line stuff, so that when the car leans over and you're cornering, it's creating more of a contact patch. So the less negative camber that you have when the car's sat in the garage, the more it's going to sit like that on the road, and the more negative camber, so around say 0.5, it would sit like this, really exaggerated, it's probably sort of like that. But when you start cornering, it's going to start getting that full patching contact rather than tipping over. So that's camber. Moving to caster settings. In sim racing, it doesn't really matter. All you're going to do is increase the weight of the wheel, and then you could decrease the force feedback strength, so you're not getting any of the negative effects of adding more caster. You can just get the positive effects in sim racing. So in caster is the angle. If you imagine this is the angle of the like this, really the angle of the suspension arm, and the wheel's sat here. Caster just changes the angle of the suspension arm, so then when you're turning the wheel, there's more camber added whilst you're turning, and then when you straighten the car up, it's a flat wheel again. You get sort of all the benefits. So for the caster section, setting the caster angle really depends on how heavy you want the wheel to feel. Adding caster will increase the effects of camber whilst turning, and caster isn't a bad thing in sim racing and can add more camber effects to the front wheels. Front wheel and increase the feeling of force feedback, but just be careful of clipping. Excessive tyre temperature ranges from the outer and inner edges. So we haven't got much delta to go on looking at the OMI readings. They're all at 79.79, but as you add more caster, you'll increase the camber wear, so just be wary of that. It's something to pay attention to. So that's everything on this first page. Let's move to the electronics. Looking at TC, traction control comes in two elements, TC and TC2. TC controls the amount of wheel slip, so as you apply the throttle, the engine management will deliver power to the wheels if there's sufficient grip. The bigger the number, the more the engine will stop you increasing or stop you accelerating if you don't have enough grip. This will kill your lap times, as it will stop you accelerating, but it will also stop you oversteering on corner exit. So that's going to be something that you need to monitor depending on your skill set, I reckon. The more of a novice you are to sim racing, the higher I would suggest setting TC, the traction control. We'll go straight down to TC2 because it sort of works in partnership. So TC2 controls the amount of power being delivered to the rear wheels. Bigger numbers will equal less horsepower, which will also reduce oversteer, but will increase the lap times. Obviously, the less power you're able to put down, the longer it is going to take to get around the circuit. So try use similar values like TC4 and traction control 2.4, or if you find that there's just a small amount of oversteer, you might want to use something like TC4, and then just like this sort of value, you might want to use TC6 It's more of a fine tuning aid, I think, but be careful. The more traction control used, the less effective that the preload's going to be. So moving to the anti-lock braking system, if the track is dry, you should try and use as low a number as you can without locking the brakes under heavy braking. This will reduce the amount of braking distance, but it can also reduce manoeuvrability in the braking zones. In wet conditions, you should look to set this higher to reduce aquaplaning and sliding over the water surface under braking. Stormy conditions, maybe around 10 to 11, and in dry conditions, I'd use around 1 to 4. I usually settle around 3. Drying or damp conditions, maybe between 5 and 9. The ECU engine map. Now this all depends on the car you're using and determines whether the car is using a high fuel to power output or a low fuel to power output. This may be needed in races where fuel load is important to last longer and reduce fueling times during your pit stops, or to conserve fuel during safety car phases. Not that there's that many of those. But different engine maps may also deliver different power applications of the throttle, like in wet conditions the throttle may be less aggressive. 1 to 4 usually dry maps, in most of the cars 1 being the fastest, and 5 to 8 are usually wet weather maps, and onwards to around 9 and 10 for some of the cars, apart from the Porsche, which is 8 is its fastest map. But generally going from 1 to 5 is like drying conditions, slightly damp conditions, and then to fully wet conditions, and then maybe the last one that you've got would be during a safety car phase where you're using very little fuel to get around the circuit. So yeah, tyres. This determines which compound you're going to be either running, and as you can see there, you can only select between wet and dry. So yeah, fuel is going to be, it's very hard to determine fuel in this game sometimes. Sometimes I don't actually 100% agree with how much fuel's being used in this section down here. You can't actually select it, but it all depends on what mode you're using. What ECU. Looking at the tyre set, this is determined by the race category you've chosen really. It can be limited to a number of sets of tyres per session, to a certain amount of tyres over the course of the whole race weekend, or it can be totally unlimited. It depends what you've chosen to set it at. Switching between sets during the session, you can also view the amount of tyre wear that's been generated from the tyre, which is usually, as you can see on the left hand side there, you start out with 2.95 tread on the tyres. It's usually, I'm sure it was usually 3.0, so I'm not sure what's changed there. Maybe it's always been 2.95. So moving to the front brakes, the brake pads vary from 1 to 4, and this is regarding the life of the brake pad, its performance in dry and wet conditions, and its effectiveness throughout a given race cycle, etc. Pads 1 will usually be favoured for anything up to about an hour in length, and pads 2 usually longer durations between maybe 3 and 12 hours long. Pads 3 and 4 don't serve much purpose really, and aren't really used by anyone in Assetto Corsa Competizione, and there's very little difference really, I think, between pads 1 and 2, but generally I'd run pads 1. The rear brakes exactly the same as the front brakes. Moving to the pit strategy section. Now, pit stops, this is the preset number for a pit stop strategy that you've chosen. Numerous different setups you can store in here, details of which will be below what you've set up. Quick adjustment in the MFD could save you a lot of time during the race messing around with pit strategies, but you may choose to set up a wet pit strategy with tyres and pressures you've already tested and saved in the pit strategy section. So this is a useful section if you're running if you've done, say, various different types of races and you know full well that say pit strategy 2 is wet tyres, and you've already set the pressures to wet conditions, and you've ran a session in that, so you know when you're practicing you can just switch between them using the MFD in the game itself. The fuel, obviously this is the fuel that's going to be added during your pit stop itself. Tyres, obviously if it rains you're going to swap onto wet compound, and tyre sets obviously is affected by tyre sets. Say for example in the fuel and tyre set up at the top of the screen you've used sets 1 to 5 during practice and qualifying, but you've still got sets 5 to 10 that you want to use in the race. So remember to set them down here to sets between 5 and 10 or something, so that you know you've got brand new fresh tyres that you're swapping onto during the race itself. And obviously you want to set the tyre pressures in this menu to the ones that you've got set in this menu here. And again, usually you won't want to change the brake pads unless you're doing a really long stint race, or you've had a cycle of say 16 times time progression. I don't know if the brakes wear out in 16 times quicker. I've got no idea if they simulate that, but obviously the day-night cycle simulated. But yeah, if you ran for 3 hours, you're probably going to want to change brake pads. If you've used brake pads 1 or an hour or something like that, you're going to want to change the brake pads. So let's move on to the main gubbins really when it comes to setting the cars up: the mechanical grip, the dampers and the aero, and the tyres obviously. So the anti-roll bars, this determines the amount of sideways loading the car rolls when cornering. Using a softer setup can allow for better traction at the front of the car during cornering, as it allows the car to maintain more tyre contact with the road. Softer settings reduce understeer but increase oversteer, and this is used to fine-tune the car balance and increase mechanical grip or reduce it depending on what you're trying to achieve. Brake power. This determines how much braking performance you have when applying the brake pedal, and if you're running no ABS you may find that at 100% it causes you to lock the wheels under heavy braking. So by reducing this figure you might find you have better control under heavy braking and you're not locking out the brakes so much. The brake bias itself, this balances front and rear brake performance, and is a great way to adjust the balance of the car during corner entry. If the car starts to oversteer during corner entry, try and increase this figure. If you find the car understeers during braking, then try and reduce it. You may also find that certain corners on circuits are navigated better using different brake balances or brake biases, and this is more of a technical aspect of driving, but it's one that is used mainly, or many drivers use, in GT3 or Formula 1. Definitely something I use on a number of circuits, just adjusting the brake balance to maybe reduce oversteer on corner entry, or even induce a little bit of corner oversteer. The steering ratio then, this reduces or increases the amount of input a driver needs to use in order to turn the wheel. The higher the number, the more the driver will need to turn the wheel to induce rotation. You may want to reduce this to make the car feel a little bit more agile. Setting this to a lower value, however, may make the car feel a little bit twitchy and hard to be precise through cornering. It may also cause you to scrub too much speed due to excessive turning angles, because obviously the less you're inputting and you're getting more turning angle, the more you're going to start scrubbing speed. More turning angle just scrubs speed. So higher numbers may feel slow to respond and suffer with understeer, whereas always use the correct wheel rotation in the setups menu, but obviously within the setup menu you've got steering rotation. Let's just have a look at it and then we know what I'm talking about. So in the controls menu you've got the steering wheel, the rotation itself, the steering lock, and make sure you set this to the right one per car, or you might have it set to auto on your wheel, I don't know, but generally I'll just adjust it to which car ever I'm getting in. But say for example I used 640 in this car when it shouldn't really be using that much. Generally when you go to your setup menu and you come to this one, because I'm using 640, it's the wrong one for the car, but I could just reduce this all the way down to there and it might feel very similar to 480. But obviously I could add and reduce more if I'd actually got it set to the right wheel rotation. So moving to the wheel rates then, that's that one done. So wheel rates, this corresponds to how stiff the suspension is. A stiffer car is better suited to smooth circuits, smoother surfaces, and less use of the curbs, while a softer suspension setup will suit bumpier circuits and more aggressive use of the curbs. Try both soft and hard setups to find the right balance during testing, and be aware that this can also affect the balance of the car. A stiffer front suspension setup will favour more understeer, while a softer setup will increase oversteer. Use small adjustments to change the balance of mechanical grip and car characteristics. The bump stop rate. The bump stop in ACC is a solid rubber block really. I don't know what it is in real life, it's probably just the same thing. And the rate of the block determines how soft the rubber is itself. So try changing this to make small changes to the overall balance of the car, which will also affect oversteer and understeer. The bump stop range, this determines how close the car sits to the bump stop itself. The lower the number, the lower the car is effectively sat on to the ground, and can cause the car to bottom out on places like Spa, going through Eau Rouge. So higher numbers may cause the car to become less responsive and just wallow around a little bit during cornering and weight transfer, but I'd recommend using between 1 and 5, maybe even 1 and 3. Some circuits like Monza, you could probably use 0 at Monza because there's really hardly any undulation at all, but obviously it depends how much you want to attack some of those curbs. And that goes the same for the front and rear, but usually you'll find the rear set a lot higher than it is at the front, just to allow the rear end to lift up slightly during braking. It's always usually set a lot higher, and you'll find that the bump stop rate is lower at the rear as well. So moving to the rear anti-roll bar, as with the front anti-roll bar, the rear acts just the same by following or by allowing more or less roll through the rear of the car when cornering. Stiffening the rear can increase oversteer, while softening it can reduce it, and stiffening the rear will also reduce understeer. The bigger the number, the stiffer the anti-roll bar effects, which would increase oversteer. So use the front and rear adjustments to balance the car and reduce excessive roll during cornering while trying to maintain as much mechanical grip as possible. The preload differential. This affects the way the car corners, allowing the driving wheels to rotate at different speeds. Lower numbers will produce less oversteer during corner exit and may increase slow speed cornering grip. In some cases it can also reduce high speed oversteer, high speed corner understeer. Higher numbers will lock the driving wheels during power application and can cause excessive wheel spin, producing oversteer when exiting the corner. This can also result in corner entry and mid-corner understeer. The preload is also affected by the amount of traction control being used, and high amounts of traction control will reduce the effectiveness of the preload itself. So if you want to feel less oversteer on corner exit, I generally use it lower, and more oversteer on corner exit. Yeah, getting the rear end of the car to power slide out, it's usually higher figures, and the lower figures will assist the car through slower speed cornering. It just allows the wheels to rotate at a different speed each. So moving to the dampers, the whole wizardry behind the suspension itself, it's a tough one really, because we haven't got Motec to use. Setting up the dampers is a minefield, to be honest, and it's probably something that PC users really benefit over more than we really do. It's a struggle to try and set the dampers up just using personal preference really. It's how the car feels. But let's have a look. Bump. This controls how quickly the suspension moves up into the wheel arch during weight transfer, and when braking the car dips forward and the wheel presses up into the wheel arch. So setting this stiffer will reduce the amount of body roll under braking and cornering. This is how the car moves around during general driving really. The rebound itself, so bump and rebound are connected together really. I don't know why they don't have bump and then rebound and then fast bump and fast rebound. It would make more sense really, but the bump and rebound work together. So looking at the rebound, this is the opposite of bump and controls how quickly the suspension returns back to its normal position. A higher number here will slow the car's response in returning back to normal. Unfortunately, due to Assetto Corsa on console not having the telemetry, it's very hard to gauge the amount of damping required for certain areas of the circuit. I'd recommend using equal figures for bump and rebound, or slightly lower. So if you have, say, 8 bump, I'd set the rebound to maybe between 8 and 4. A good place to start with a damper setting is to run very similar suspension settings. So say for example, in this scenario, we've got a higher suspension. Say we're running equal suspensions, or very, if we can get them, can we get them equal? Sort of similar, 151,000 newton meters and 155 newton meters, 1,000. So then you would go and you'd probably run a very similar 5 at the front, 5 at the rear. So if we go back to mechanical and we look at, say, running a really stiff front suspension, then you would go back and you would run maybe a very stiff damper setup. So they work together, so try using them together. So where were we? Looking at the fast bump, this controls the way the car handles the curbs and the bumps in the circuit, mostly the curbs really. This is usually set slightly softer than the initial bump and rebound settings. So say for example we're using the 10, maybe you go for 5, 6, 7, something like that, which affects the curbs. So looking at the fast rebound, as with the rebound setting, try setting this as a little bit lower than the fast bump setting to allow the suspension to quickly return to its original position. Damping can be very hard to get right without the telemetry, and don't get all beaten up about it. That's definitely something worth thinking about. So just set it up very similar to bump and rebound. So say if you're using 7, so if you imagine bump pushing up into the car itself, if you set this higher, it will take longer for it to return back to how it should be. So if you use a lower setting, as it goes back up, it's going to push back down quicker, so it'll return ready for the next bump a lot faster. So try and use, like, say 7 and 4, 7 and 5, but I won't go too far down here. It'd be like a pogo stick trying to push itself back to center really quickly, whereas this would just be really deadened. It'll just take a while to return back to where it should be. So moving to the ride height then, I'll cover this ride height front and rear. So choosing the ride height, lower is better, but running too low can cause problems hitting curbs and bottoming out over bumps. It may also affect the airflow at the rear of the car and reduce the effectiveness of the rear diffuser. Ride height also affects how quickly the car rotates during cornering. Make small adjustments to the rake angle or the ride height. It's generally called rake, the angle of the car, the ride height, to see how it changes the cornering entry. Usually the rear is set higher than the front, but this isn't a golden rule to live by on Assetto Corsa Competizione. So just by increasing the ride height at the rear, say for example, and leaving the front where it is, the car will be so much more agile, but it'll start to oversteer on corner entry much quicker. So if you're oversteering on corner entry, just try reducing the rear end of the car a little bit. As if you ran like that, you'd probably suffer a lot with understeer. You'd be turning into the corners, and the car wouldn't want to turn at all. So gradually start increasing that till the car starts to turn into the corners nicely. And when it starts losing the rear end on corner entry, you know you've gone too far and just come back a notch. The rear wing then, this will affect the temperature. No, the higher the number, the more grip will be generated during high-speed cornering. Anything above about 80 miles per hour will usually be affected by wing elements. Increase the rear wing will reduce straight line speed but increase acceleration and cornering grip, and it will also have an effect on reducing oversteer during high-speed cornering. It will also reduce braking as well. The more rear wing you've got, it'll increase the braking performance. But obviously the more rear wing you've got will cause drag as well. And I often think in Assetto Corsa Competizione that rear wing also affects front wing as well. It just increases overall grip as far as I'm concerned, not just at the rear. So brake ducts, this will affect the temperature of the rear brakes under braking, and it will also affect on how hot the tyres get during braking, and how quickly the tyres and brakes cooling down during phases where you're just accelerating or freewheeling. Rear brakes perform best when they're around 400 to 500 degrees. Sometimes you can see this by adjusting the MFD, the on-screen HUD itself, the in-car HUD. Especially in the McLaren, you can see what sort of temperatures the brakes are running at. It's not a feature in every car. But try and keep them green or light green on the graphic. And if you're doing a fully wet race, you may find that closing out the brakes will increase the tyre temperatures and just allow you to get more temperature in the tyres. The front splitter, obviously on the Ferrari there isn't any front splitter, but use some cars like the Porsche you can adjust this. And this is just another term for the front wing and can increase cornering grip at high speeds. Just be aware that it will also increase drag and produce less downforce at the rear of the car. Try and find a balance with both the rear and the front grip to increase aerodynamic grip while still allowing good performance and minimum drag on the straights. Too much downforce can reduce the chances of overtaking on straights due to low top speeds. This can especially be challenging at circuits like Spa and Bathurst, even Monza, where you're trying to run the lower wing but you're wanting to have some sort of downforce through like the mountain section of Bathurst. So it really is a fine balance that you're going to have to find. So hopefully, just running through these, I'll just click on them and you'll see the graphic changing on the right hand side of the screen. So everything that I've gone through, you'll be able to see what I was talking about, and you could sit and read that yourselves. Maybe it looks a lot better than the previous version. Just as I'm sort of flicking through, I'll change them. It probably is quite hard for me to do, just changing through these, but hopefully you'll be able to see. There's just a lot more detail. It is a pity, I think, that there isn't anything. I mean, you can adjust, as we adjust these, you can see the graphic adjusts, but it's really not useful data really. It just shows you how close things are sitting to each other, but it would be nice to be able to see some telemetry, even while you're driving, the telemetry like on Forza or Project Cars 2, just to see some sort of on-screen data. Hopefully that'll come to Series X or PS4, PS5, just some more detail. One of the things that I don't particularly like, so yeah, one of the other things on this page, you can see there, we've got it right again now. All the way here must have been tyres that I've been using, so yeah, as we switch further down, it is 3.0. So yeah, just remove that. The graphics don't particularly work right in where the wearing is. You'll see that the outer side of the tyre and the inside of the tyre have the wrong values the wrong way around. So that might be something just to bear in mind when you're looking at your tyre delta. But yeah, I hope that's been useful. A very boring probably video, but whether it gives you a little bit of an insight as to what some of these things do, might be a little bit better than the details that are given on the right hand side as per normal. But thanks for watching, and ciao for now.